if there's one good thing that has come from these earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, it is the global public interest in the sanctions that the West has been imposing on Syria for the last, it must be 11, coming up to 12 years now. Having had no interest in this country and just allowing Syria to suffer for more than a decade, finally there is interest in what sanctions actually do in Syria and by extension do in other countries as well. So while Syria has the global attention on what the West is doing to this country, I want to give you my experience of living in the country during the early period of the sanctions. Whenever the West describes sanctions in a country, they always focus the attention on it being targeted at the dictator or the rich, the wealthy, the oligarchs, and this is just pure propaganda that the West imposes on its people. I remember reading something in a newspaper in the United Kingdom after coming back from Syria that spoke about how President Bashar al-Assad was now suffering because he could no longer buy Rolex watches and caviar. And honestly, I didn't know what emotion to have, whether I should be angry at the lie that such a remark was, or be so sad. So I don't know. And even now, I cannot fully express the emotions I have when I read the bollocks, the total crap that the West spew out about sanctions. What's happening in the United States now is that they have agreed to suspend the sanctions against Syria for 180 days. And what this reveals is the fact that sanctions do affect poor people. If this really was just about Bashar al-Assad and Rolex watches and caviars, why would the earthquake have any impact? Why would sanctions need to be suspended if this was just about Rolex watches and caviar? The truth of the matter is, it isn't. It is about medicine, clothing, all these essential items that are desperately in need of in these poorer countries that just become much more scarce over time. And when they are available, become much more expensive, that even though they are essential items, they become out of the reach of the most vulnerable people, the young, the poor, the homeless. I was there in 2011 and 2012. And just to give you some idea of how sanctions impact everybody. You know, you would go to a shop, for example, and you would buy an egg. Let's keep it very simple, an egg. And this egg would cost you, let's say, 1 coin. It doesn't matter what the currency is. It just costs you 1 coin to buy an egg. You go back the next day and it now costs you 2 coins to buy an egg. And by the end of the week, by the end of the month, the eggs are, you see fewer of them in shops. Shops have run out of them, they can't get a new stock, and so when they do get eggs, they become much more expensive. So, you know, after a month, after a couple of months, you can be paying 10 times for something as simple as an egg that you did before the sanctions hit. And, you know, you can extrapolate the story of the egg to all food, all essential items. Another thing about Syria that I experienced when I was there during the sanctions Syria has their gas delivered in gas bottles, and very quickly it became increasingly difficult to get a new gas bottle when your gas bottle ran out. And you need these gas bottles because they heat the water in your home, and you use the gas to fuel the cookers so that you can cook food. So absolutely essential part of a home, family life. And when my gas bottle ran out, I was lucky enough I lived opposite a cafe, and I knew the guy who ran the cafe, and he was buying these gas bottles, like four of them a week. So then all he did one time was to buy an extra gas bottle and then sell it to me. And of course, he made a profit on that gas bottle, and no doubt the guy that sold it to him made a profit on the bottle. And what quickly happens is that the gas bottles and other essential items start to fall into the hands of black marketeers. And because you have to buy these things, they are not a choice. You need gas in your home. You need to cook your food. You need to wash your clothes. You need to wash your body. You have to pay for these things. So it doesn't matter how much they cost. You have to pay for them. So inevitably, what you start to do is sacrifice other things so that you can buy the gas bottle. So you would see parents go without food. You'd see them buy less for themselves and more for the kids, and put less on their plates so that their children would not go to school feeling hungry. And you'd see adults, and particularly mothers, it's always mothers, you'd see them tired during the day because they just weren't eating. And yet they were still trying to raise their children. Actually, it's not fair to just say mothers. It's fathers as well, who go out to work, their stomach is half full, and they also have the psychological issue of not feeling able to provide for their family. So there's a lot of mental anguish attached to sanctions as well. And I heard stories that some women would do favors for men in order to get a gas bottle. So it very quickly becomes something that ordinary people in the West would be disgusted by, ashamed of, to think that their governments caused this thing to be necessary. We need to end all the sanctions in Syria, but not just for the 180 days. We need to end the sanctions in Syria for always. And in fact, I would take it even further and say we need to end all sanctions everywhere. Because sanctions, let's call sanctions for what they are. They are the most cruel, persistent form of economic torture that rich Western governments can impose on poorer nations. And that is exactly what is happening. And the reason why Western governments and Western media keeps that fact from Western people is because they know, as decent human beings, we would never allow our governments to do that. So they lie and say that this is just targeted against the rich and the powerful. So, end all sanctions in Syria right now. Work with Bashar al-Assad. Help build Syria. Simply because it's what we do as human beings, as decent, caring human beings. We help the most vulnerable. At the very least, we don't allow our governments, our powerful, rich governments, to cause greater suffering on those who are more vulnerable and more poor than we are. I personally have seen too much suffering cruelly imposed by heartless Western governments on these countries. And the thing is, the governments know that sanctions don't work in the way that they describe they're going to work to Western people. There hasn't been a single shred of evidence that sanctions anywhere in the world have forced a government to change its policy, or forced a nation of people to overthrow its leader, which is what the Western governments were hoping would happen in Syria, with people getting so annoyed that they had no food, no clothes, no jobs, that they would eventually get rid of Bashar al-Assad. And they won't. And the reason why they won't is because they don't blame their leaders for the sanctions, the cruelty, the torture, the suffering that Western sanctions are imposing on them. The people they blame are Western governments, and rightly so. They know it's not Putin, they know it's not Assad, they know it is Western governments. And our governments know that these sanctions don't work, but they still impose them, because ultimately what they want to do is destroy the country, and they do it economically. So they allow these poor people to suffer long term. I mean, in the case of Syria and Iran, over a decade. Generations grow up not being properly fed or properly educated or properly clothed, in the hope that eventually things will change in the way that the West want them to change. We, as decent people, should demand our governments outlaw sanctions. Make them an illegal act of war. Stop all sanctions. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye now.